Thank you very much. I should say I've not been asked by the government to advise them on their abortion or euthanasia policy. I'm not quite sure why that should be the case. It's great to be here, and I wanted to start by paying tribute to you, because I know many of you are in universities, in schools, in your workplace, and it can be hard. And it's worth noting that things don't change that much. I was a student many years ago, in fact with Alethia's mum and dad. We were in the student section of SPUC. Nowadays we hear lots of stories about speakers being banned, groups being banned, and you have a hard time. It was the same then. So I was at two different universities for an undergraduate and master's. Both of them, they tried to ban speakers. You try and put out a leaflet. Oh no, you can't put that leaflet. It says this rather than that. Tried to ban the groups themselves. It's worth remembering what's going on, because it's happening a lot now. It's happened in Ireland over the past few months with protests to try and stop public meetings. What's going on, I think, is that there's the campaign from the pro-abortion side. It's focused on one thing. It's about focusing on the person, the people and the groups on the pro-life side as a tactic to avoid speaking about the arguments. And the focus is very often, not for everybody of course, but very often on targeting and isolating and trying to make out that your case and you are so extreme that it is not worth debating. The target is always to avoid the debate. Okay? And it's important to bear that in mind, because you can have self-doubts. You can think, oh, actually, maybe they've got a point, or did I state that the wrong way? Take a step back and think what's happening and what the tactic tends to be. Now, I'm going to talk about a number of things. I'm an economist, and the day I found out that economists could actually study things like abortion, assisted suicide, it was great, because it's... by the way, economists are trained to have no morals. We have no opinion on what's right or wrong. It's all about... Well, it's not all about money. People think it's all about money. But actually, there is a sense in which we are taught to be a little bit detached. I don't know if there's anyone studying economics here. Hopefully there is. But I think what it does help is that we can take a little bit of a dispassionate view of what happens when you do something. Not necessarily what's right or wrong, but what happens when you do something. Actually, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what is right or wrong. But of course, in a public debate, hearts and minds are not always one on the point of principle. They're often one on, what the effects we can see might be. So taking a step back from that, I just wanted to start with a particular case many of you will be aware of. I'm going to talk about euthanasia and assisted suicide, although I'll talk a little bit about abortion as well. This is a case from the Netherlands, which I'm sure many of you saw, where a woman who had dementia was down to be euthanized. Okay, we know euthanasia is legal in the Netherlands. Now, this woman had written a living will which was slightly ambivalent, but had said that in certain circumstances she would want to be killed, but she was no longer in her, she had dementia. And she said on several occasions that she didn't want to die. But the family and the doctor felt it was in her best interest to be euthanized. What the doctor did was to put a dose of tranquilizer in her coffee to calm the woman down. Okay? Then that didn't work effectively. When he was when the doctor was trying to inject her, the woman was resisting, and so he had to ask family members to hold her down so that she could be injected. Now, that's not actually the shocking thing. Of course, it's shocking. It's terrible. The shocking thing is that the investigation into the case did not say what a despicable thing that went on. They actually said that this was done for the best intentions. They said possibly putting the tranquilizer in the coffee was going a bit over the top, but not that the doctor should be sanctioned, or there should be a great scandal at how this should never have happened. But the recommendation was really, well, can we look a bit more closely so that cases like this, where somebody hasn't said they want to die and it's not clear about the consent, that we can make sure that they can be killed according to a certain protocol. The reason for starting with that is because when you are labelled as extremists or beyond the pale, people who are not worth even debating with because you're so out of the mainstream, it's worth remembering cases like this, okay, and the state we're in. And we could pick any number of examples of stories from the abortion side, from the euthanasia side, and it's worth just sort of bearing these in mind. But as I said, I'm not really going to talk so much about the rights or wrongs of things. I want to remind ourselves what we do in pro-life activity, and we could have lots more things than this, but I think these are the three big areas. We provide help for people who are pregnant, or maybe people who are in difficult situations at the end of life. Probably the vast majority of the work we and you do is about education. We can't do anything unless we inform people about the facts and the evidence. But of course, ultimately, we also want to change laws. We want to have laws that will protect the start of life and at the end of life. And of course, we've got to be realistic about the culture we're in. And not everyone can focus always on changing the law. But ultimately, that's what certainly SPUC was founded to do, that we would have just laws in our society. And there's lots of ways we can debate and talk about these. The thing I wanted to focus on today was this debate, which often goes on. People try and argue on both abortion and euthanasia. Fine, we can understand the case for a pro-life law, but it doesn't work. It's completely useless. I'm sure you've heard of this argument that, okay, you could have a law against abortion, but women would have abortions anyway. So you're much better off focusing on, provide contraception or sex education. That's how you're going to reduce abortions. An abortion law won't change things. And people say the same at the other end of life. They talk about assisted suicide or euthanasia. And they say, well, actually, an assisted suicide law isn't going to lead to more suicides. So if you have a law that legalises assisted suicide, you won't increase the number of suicides. So, a law against euthanasia or assisted suicide might be fine in principle, but what's the point in practice? Now, I think that sort of argument is incredibly powerful to people who are otherwise, sympathetic. If of course, in a sense, it doesn't matter, because we don't have a law just because it's going to work. If we think of a law against slavery, why do we have a law against slavery? Because slavery is wrong, it's unjust. And of course, we would hope that would eliminate slavery, and we might do things to try and make sure that happens. So it might not just be the law, but the law in itself does matter. But of course, if people say, well, you're not going to reduce abortions anyway, you're not going to save any babies' lives by, having a law reducing the time limit on abortion, or reducing the grounds for abortion, or banning assisted suicide, whatever it might be, it's a much harder battle to win. So that's the sort of thing I wanted to focus a little bit more on today. And if we think about legal restrictions, we can think of a number of things which matter, which happen, where we might expect them to have an effect. So we can think that a legal restriction, and economists like to think in terms of costs and benefits, we're not talking about money, but when something is against the law, it effectively creates an opportunity cost. It makes things a little bit more difficult, whether that's practically, because you have to go through barriers and find illegal operators, or socially. So when something's against the law, the culture can be affected. The law has an effect on how people perceive things. So when a suicide, even though it's decriminalised, is seen as against the law, and to assist somebody to commit their suicide is seen as wrong, it tends to create the culture in society where that is generally seen to be wrong. And of course, we might expect when the cost of something increases, even if it's not the monetary cost, we should expect less of that to happen. And indeed, as we'll see, there's some evidence that that's the case. Of course, laws do other things as well. It's not just about changing behaviour and stopping the thing that you're legislating against. One of the things that laws can do very powerfully is help vulnerable people. Okay? And I think that's something to bear in mind throughout the pro-life debate. Actually, of course, the principles and the high-level philosophy and ethics are really, really important. But what we are doing ultimately is looking at measures, all sorts of measures, practical, educational and legal, which improve the lives of the most vulnerable. And it's always the most vulnerable who are the most effective, I think, by laws that are not pro-life. So a law in general, not just on pro-life, should be there. You don't need to protect the powerful, the strong, as much as the most vulnerable. And of course, at the beginning and the end of life, we can't think of people who are more vulnerable than the baby in the womb, or that elderly lady with dementia, or somebody severely disabled, and perhaps it's a little bit more difficult to speak out for themselves for practical or physical reasons. Okay. However, what is the evidence? And that's, as an economist, what I'm interested in, looking at the statistics and I hope you all love statistics. No? Oh, well, never mind. I won't sort of go too heavy on the statistics, but it's something that does interest me, because actually, course, what's right or wrong really matters. That's what we're here for. But looking at the evidence, I think, is really important too. And it's quite interesting looking at the more general social science evidence on many of these issues. And we shouldn't expect it always to come up with the answers we might want. Okay? It's not about that. Social science and evidence, there can be all sorts of ways of looking at data. You don't always get the answer you expect or you might want to see. And that shouldn't bother us. We should be looking for what is true, whether or not it supports our argument. Okay? But a couple of things I want to say. I'll talk a little bit more about assisted suicide and euthanasia, but I wanted to say a bit about abortion laws. Actually, there's been a lot of work by economists and others looking at these. And there's a couple of ways you can think about abortion laws. In the culture we're in, and in the States and in most countries, we're often not looking at a case of banning abortion completely. We might like that. That might be our objective. But it's not something that we can see politically is likely to happen in the next year or two. I'm a huge optimist, and I think change can happen very radically and very suddenly when you do the right thing. Okay? And we shouldn't give up that hope of having radical change. Okay? But very often we can think, well, are there laws which are just, which are good laws, which can help vulnerable people at the margin? And there's some interesting cases in the United States. The United States is a great experimental testing ground because they have 50-odd states where those states can introduce some of the laws themselves. So, for example, many of the states have introduced laws where parents have to be involved before a child has an abortion. You probably know, perhaps you don't, but in this country, you can be 13, potentially even younger, and have an abortion, and the law says your parents do not have to be informed, let alone give their consent. Okay? And indeed, there was a case from Nottingham, a case in Nottinghamshire a few years ago, where a school nurse arranged an abortion for a minor, for somebody under 16, and the girl had an abortion, was sent home with the abortion pill, and the mum knew about it was when her daughter was miscarrying in the room upstairs as a result of the pill. It's quite a staggering thought, actually, because you think at school, you have to sign a form in triplicate to get a school to give you aspirin or a paracetamol. This mother actually went to court to say, well, surely this can't be legal, and the courts confirmed, no, in certain circumstances that can be legal for a 13, 14, 15-year-old to have an abortion without parents even knowing, without the parents even being told. Okay? Now, in the United States, a number of states have introduced laws saying, well, okay, let's make it the case we won't make abortion illegal, but if you have an abortion, a parent has to be told, or in some cases have to give permission, with some exceptions where there's worries about child abuse. There have been other cases, so looking at informed consent, where mothers have to be given certain information about the development of the baby or the potential risks before an abortion. There have been laws about the funding of abortions, which is slightly different in America. Other laws about a waiting period, saying that when you go for your first ask for an abortion, you've got to wait at least 24 hours before having an abortion. These are very useful and interesting experiments, if you like, apart from, we can discuss whether that's the right sort of approach or whether these laws are helpful. Because in the States, you can look at the states that introduce the laws, other states that were perhaps otherwise similar that didn't introduce the laws, and see what happened to abortion rates, but also what happened to teenage pregnancy rates. So is it the case that abortion was a bit more difficult and you had loads more teens giving birth, which, as pro-lifers, we might say, well, that's certainly better than abortion, but you talk to many people out in the world, it's something they're very worried about. They don't want their 13-year-old daughter having a baby at that age, and of course that's not an ideal situation, but for some people they would much rather abortion be there than that birth happen. Well, you can look at some of the evidence. What does it say? There's also more fundamental abortion bans, so we're going to hear lots about Ireland later on, and that's massively in the news. Generally speaking, abortion is illegal in Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. There have been some other interesting cases where there have been changes in the law. So Chile, Poland, coming out of its communist history, they broadly made abortion illegal in the 90s. Nicaragua as well had a big change to its abortion law. These provide quite interesting case studies to look at some of the evidence. This is some of the academic evidence. There's a whole range of academic papers on these sort of incremental laws in the States, which I can guide you through. By the way, I've got a copy of some of the references if people want to take those later on, or I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides if you want to look up some of the studies or get some more information on them. Generally speaking, the academic studies suggest that abortion laws do work. So these sort of abortion laws in the States about parental notification, they do reduce abortions. It's not just the case that abortions go on illegally, and there's lots of ways of measuring this, because illegal abortions are hard to measure. But actually what seems to happen is that it changes behaviour. So it's not just that abortions go down, but teenage pregnancies as a whole go down, for example, when parents have to be informed. And that shouldn't be a complete surprise. If you think about the decision-making process that a youngster might go through, and knowing that their parent, if you get pregnant, their parent will find out, okay, gives a different situation about the decisions you might take before that event than if you know you can have an abortion in secret. It's sort of there, whether or not you will actually go through with it if you do get pregnant, but feeling that that option is there can make a difference. And that's one of the things that economists are interested in that sort of effect of incentives, how when a law changes, how that can change behaviour, often in ways that you don't expect. So in fact, the parental notification laws, very interesting, because not only did teenage pregnancies go down, teenage births didn't seem to have gone up. Okay? So, it's almost like a win-win situation. STIs, so sexually transmitted infections, there's some very good evidence that they decreased in the states introducing these types of laws. Okay? There's actually some other evidence saying that suicides amongst young people went down as well in those states. And it's quite a fascinating area, which I think isn't well known enough. But the bottom line is, in general, abortion laws work. Some are more effective than others. Okay. What about the sort of more fundamental abortion bans? Well, again, there's some academic evidence. I won't go through the academic studies, but I thought it might just be interesting to look at Ireland, as that's in the news at the moment. I'm sorry, I'm just putting my specs on so I can see what's on the screen. Oh, yeah, okay. I'm in the right place. That's good. This is the abortion rate in England and Wales at the moment, in the latest figures we got, which is 2016. Although abortion is illegal in Ireland, we know that lots of Irish women do come over to the UK to have abortions, either in England and Wales or in a few in Scotland, not so many in Scotland. This is the abortion rate in Ireland. It's massively, massively lower than in the UK. So one of the arguments going on in Ireland is saying, well, women are having abortions anyway, they're just doing it more expensively and going over to England. Actually, yeah, that does happen, but the number of abortions is drastically lower than happens in England and Wales, which is, of course, what we'd expect. Now, there may be some debate, of course. There's concerns about abortion pills being picked up on the internet, and there may be some effect there. But actually, you track back and look at the figures over the past 10, 20 years, that difference has not changed drastically. So it's not the case that, or there doesn't seem to be evidence that massively more women are getting abortion pills in Ireland, although that may be happening to some extent. That doesn't explain the difference in abortion rates. However, what about cases like we talked about teenagers? This is a case for under 16s. People are particularly worried about abortions and teenage pregnancies amongst young girls. Abortion rate for under 16s, the difference is much bigger. And in fact, you can think probably for under 16s, there's perhaps less likelihood of getting abortion pills, paying for that over the internet. That may be debatable. So the evidence is the abortion laws in Ireland are effective in reducing the number of abortions. Okay? Now, this isn't a causal study. You can look at causal effects, but the difference is so stark. One of the questions, because one of the things I've published on is looking at teenage pregnancy statistics. Is it the case, though, that you've got many more girls in Ireland giving birth, below the age of 16? No, you haven't. The rate of births for teenagers under the age of 16 in Ireland is less than half that in England and Wales. And in fact, the rate in England and Wales has decreased quite a lot over the past 8 or 9 years. And that's an interesting story in itself. We could always talk about that in questions later on if you wanted. So it has too in Ireland. The rate has gone down. Even though abortion has not been legal, the rate of under 16 births is one of the lowest in Europe. When people talk about the success stories in relation to sexual health and policy for maternal health for women and so on, what are the countries they pick out? They always talk about the Netherlands, don't they, or Scandinavia. Actually, they should be talking about Ireland. I'm sure Patricia will tell us more about this later on. Ireland is where you should be talking about as one of the great success stories in Europe, for example, on the issue of teenage pregnancy. Why Ireland are thinking about trying to copy the UK, England and Wales and Scotland on the abortion issue is beyond me. Just sort of very briefly, maternal health is a really big issue. I know Patricia will talk more about that later on. But is it the case that abortion laws affect maternal health? The evidence probably isn't. This is a maternal mortality rates for England and Wales over the past 20, 30 years. These are the rates for Ireland. So Ireland has a lower rate of maternal mortality than England and Wales. What about one of the other cases? We could look at any of the countries like Nicaragua and Chile, but Poland's quite a nice example. So Poland changed its abortion law in around about 1993. That's that dotted line on the graph. Its rates of maternal mortality were quite high at that point, and they were going down. They carried on going down very significantly, even though abortion was effectively, in most cases, illegal. They are much, much lower. They're actually lower than in Ireland. They are much lower than in England and Wales. So this argument that abortion laws are necessary to protect maternal health doesn't seem to hold up. Okay, so that was sort of a preamble because I think the issue and the point about pro-life laws is much more general. The reason I wanted to talk about assisted suicide and euthanasia is two reasons. Firstly, it's an area I've been doing some research over the past couple of years with David Jones from the Anscombe Bioethical Institute. And we had a paper published in the Southern Medical Journal a couple of years ago looking at assisted suicide statistics, and we're doing some updated work on this at the moment. And of course, it's the front line of much of the pro-life debate. You know, we've got Ireland going on, we've got decriminalisation of abortion in England and Wales and Scotland potentially, but right around the world, the pressure to introduce, to some extent, euthanasia laws. We've seen that in Canada, although that was induced by the courts rather than Parliament changing things, but where parliaments tend to be focusing on assisted suicide. And actually, I think ethically, I'm not going to go into the ethics, but the ethics of assisted suicide and euthanasia, I think, are pretty much indistinguishable. You know, if you've got a law which permits a doctor to help somebody to commit suicide by giving them the drugs, it's not particularly different ethically to that doctor actually doing the injection themselves. Okay. Now, I think people sometimes have an issue in the pro-life movement with talking about euthanasia and assisted suicide, and people sometimes find it a little bit harder to debate it and articulate why it's wrong. We might have an instinct that there's something not right going on here. Okay? And there's a couple of things we might say, you know, in terms of why it's wrong. Firstly, we might say, well, you know, there's never any safeguards. You can have an assisted suicide or a euthanasia law, but you'll have cases like in the Netherlands, that case we saw earlier on, where any safeguards you got in won't work. And that's absolutely true. Yeah. Okay. You also have the case of sort of so-called slippery slope arguments, and professors of philosophy often try and dismiss this out of hand, but I think the evidence is actually overwhelming, that whenever euthanasia or assisted suicide starts, the scope of it always expands. So we've seen that in a number of cases. You may have followed the debate in Belgium a couple of years ago where they had a big debate about whether euthanasia would be extended. It started for over 18s. Would it be extended to children? And the response came in, yes, actually, children should be, if it's right and kind for older people, why shouldn't children take advantage of euthanasia? In Holland, we had the same debate a few years before that, talking about the very start of life, very severely disabled babies. Should they be allowed to be euthanized? Of course, they can't give their permission to be euthanasia, so it's not voluntary euthanasia. And the response came back was a bit of a fudge. And you had some protocols that came in that allowed doctors to kill babies with spina bifida, sometimes with Down syndrome, under certain conditions, without being prosecuted. So whether or not it's strictly legal is a moot point. It happens in practice. So, yeah, that's a good argument. You know, the slippery slope, the scope of euthanasia, it starts with people who are terminally ill, just a fixed amount of time to live, but it also, it comes to other groups. The mentally ill is a big discussion in America and Canada at the moment, whether they should be included in the euthanasia scope, and in Holland. Another argument, doctors shouldn't be involved in killing. Hopefully some of you are thinking of going into the medical care as doctors or maybe nurses, and it's a very powerful argument. You know, doctors are there to cure, and to make doctors be involved in killing is perhaps fundamentally wrong and against the ethos of medicine. And you may have followed the case in Canada just last week, where a court ruled that doctors didn't have the right to completely opt out of euthanasia in one of the Canadian provinces. So if they didn't like euthanasia, okay, they didn't have to administer the drugs themselves, but they had to arrange an appointment with another doctor who would. So it's hard to see how that isn't sort of complicit participation in the case of euthanasia. So there is a very, very big issue for doctors and nurses with these laws. But fundamentally, they're not the real reasons why euthanasia is wrong. Euthanasia and assisted suicide is a fundamental abuse of human rights. Okay? It's fatal discrimination against the vulnerable just as much as abortion is. And sometimes that's hard to get because people think, well, okay, euthanasia, but somebody's asked to be killed. Surely that's slightly different. But actually it's not, because what euthanasia law says always is that one group of people can be selected, and if they say, oh, I want to die, we'll say, okay, yes, you can. But if another group of people, say somebody like me who's perhaps fit and well, got a family, got a nice life, and so on, said, oh, I want to commit suicide, I go to the top of this building and try to jump off, what the law would say is, no, you're not allowed to help that person at all. In fact, you have to say, no, David, come on, your life's worth living. Hopefully your children love you, or your wife loves you, and you've got something worth living for. Don't commit suicide. And if you do jump off, an ambulance will come and help you. Well, of course, that is literally discrimination. And who's it discrimination against? As always, it's discrimination against the most vulnerable. It's the disabled, the severely disabled, who are most affected. It's the people who are terminally ill and perhaps losing their state of mind. It's the people who are in a nursing home and their family are sort of perhaps visiting them, but they know that really their family would have a better quality of life if they didn't have to come and care for them every day or every week, and they feel that implicit pressure, okay, whether or not it's spoken, right? So that's really why euthanasia is wrong. I said at the start, economists, that we don't believe in right or wrong, but I wanted to make that clear because whatever I say about what the effect of the laws is, really that's why we're in this business. That's what really matters. This is the key argument. Here's a case, just to illustrate this. This is a case in Canada. Candice Lewis, who's the younger girl in the picture, she had spina bifida, quite severely disabled. Her mother took her to hospital, and the doctor said to the mother, in front of her daughter, do you think your daughter's time has come and she would qualify under our new euthanasia laws? There'd be the mother had never mentioned this, the daughter had never mentioned this, the doctor raised the issue. And the mother was obviously quite aghast, and she claims her daughter, I'm not surprised, has been traumatised because she heard this conversation. Okay, it's a horrible case again, but a case we can see that a law puts that pressure on people who are vulnerable and in difficult, she had a mother who could speak up for her and put a complaint into the hospital. Fantastic. But, not all parents have the ability or the willingness or know what to do in that sort of situation. Okay? So, having said that, I now want to go back to say, well, what about the argument that having a law against assisted suicide actually doesn't make any difference anyway? And this argument has been made just as much as it's made on abortion. People saying, oh, women will have abortions anyway, back streets or whatever. People say the same about suicide. There's a very eminent economist called Richard Posner. He's actually now a leading judge in the United States. And actually he's a possible candidate for Supreme Court in years to come. Probably he's actually not a Democrat, but he's very radically pro-euthanasia and is a potential pick. He's been talked about. We'll have to see. Very, very top economist. He has made this argument about why assisted suicide could actually reduce suicides. So he says, take the case of a patient who has a poor diagnosis. It's told by the doctor, you've got a degenerative disease, you've maybe got 3 or 4 years to live, and eventually your life will be absolutely terrible. You won't be able to feed yourself, go to the toilet, and so on. You're going to have a terrible quality of life. Okay? That happens a lot. Two things might be true. And by the way, economists, we always like to sort of simplify things and build up these sort of models. We get criticised for assuming everything away, assuming sort of realism away. But strong defence of that. Any of you used a map, Google Maps, to get down from Scotland to to stone to here, you would have used a model. You'd have used a simplified model of reality. The maps don't have all the things that are irrelevant to getting from A to B. And economics models are a bit like that. They can be good or they can be bad, like you can have a good or a bad map. What matters is whether they give you an insight into behaviour and give you a structure for analysing things. But that's my defence of economics. So looking at this sort of simplified view of reality, the diagnosis might be wrong. And the patient knows this. It may not just be wrong, it could be literally wrong, may not have this disease, that's possible. Or it may be that when they get into that situation where they are really suffering, that actually they won't feel quite so bad. Okay? That actually they may suffer even, but they may not want to, may not wish they were dead. They maybe feel they've got some quality of life and feel they have something to live for. Or things may not be as bad as the doctor said. Or maybe the diagnosis will be right. And if the diagnosis is right, this patient believes they're going to be in this terrible, terrible state. And this is the simplification. So this patient is there thinking, okay, if I'm in that state, when I get to that state, I would prefer to die. So if I'm in a state where I can't feed myself, people have got to look after me all the time, I maybe can't swallow properly, whatever it might be. On the other hand, they know there is this possibility. They don't know how they'll feel in that situation. Okay? But what Posner says is that in that situation, they may want to die, or they're worried they want to die, but they're also worried that they won't have the ability to commit suicide. So if the law says that suicide is, it's against the law to help somebody to commit suicide, and you're in that state where you can't do anything, you can't feed yourself, you can't ask your friend or partner or wife to help you commit suicide, or if you do, you're taking a big risk with them, and they may end up in prison, and you love them and you may not want that to happen. So Posner says, okay, well, going back, if you know that's not an option or a very difficult option, you may be more likely to commit suicide early on, when you get that diagnosis, when you first can. And he produces some sort of case study evidence suggesting that this might be the case. Okay? That some people commit suicide because they're worried about not being able to commit suicide later on, so they commit it early. Okay? And I don't think that's an unreasonable argument or thing to think about, actually. I'm not saying it's true for everybody, but for saying there may be some people who are genuinely worried about how they will feel. And of course, we know that actually things can change. You can be in that situation, and often how you feel can be about the care you get and the love you get. And of course, that's the other side of things, how important it is for somebody in any vulnerable situation to demonstrate the love you have for them. But it doesn't necessarily matter. If you're in that position, you get the diagnosis, you may genuinely be worried. So what Posner argues is that if assisted suicide is not an option in the future, then for some people, you're more likely to commit suicide now. Okay? So if you have an assisted suicide law, two things will happen. So assisted suicide means you know that the doctor can give you a drug if you're incapacitated, and you've got that assurance. So for some people, they will get into that state, they will want to die, they'll ask the doctor for the thing, and they will have assisted suicide rather than committing suicide themselves at an earlier stage. So you'll get some people shifting from one to the other. But you'll get some people who will decide not to commit suicide, because I know I can do it when I'm really ill. They will then perhaps get really ill, but actually feel differently. Feel, okay, I was worried how awful it was going to be, but my family's still here, I want to stay here with them, and they don't want to take advantage of assisted suicide. So what Posner argued is that overall, total suicides could go down when you have assisted suicide. And it sounds a weird sort of argument, but I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. It's not something that you can say, well, that's definitely not going to be the case. It may not be the case, because of course there's lots of other arguments about suicide. If you introduce assisted suicide, you lower the taboos against suicide. If society, like we said earlier on, if society is saying, well, this thing is legal, people start to see it as right. And of course people can start to feel pressure to commit suicide when they wouldn't otherwise. So we don't have to say that Posner is definitely right, but one of his big arguments is that even if, you induce some extra suicides, the non-assisted suicides should go down because some of those people will shift. And of course, when you've got suicide that's illegal, it can be messy, it can go wrong. He saw that as a strong argument in favour of the law changing. So that's putting as best I can, I think, this argument in favour of assisted suicide. But as always, we need to look and see what the evidence says. Is he right? And now we have some evidence on this question. So there have been a whole series of states in the US, and as I said, this is a very good experimental ground, where they have introduced assisted suicide laws. So it started with Oregon, way back in 1998, then Washington, then Montana, which is a bit ambivalent. They didn't actually change the law, but they sort of decriminalised it, so that's sort of a partial case. We've had Vermont, then just 2 years ago, you may have seen a big fuss in California, but also in Colorado, and more recently Washington, Hawaii. These laws are under consideration in a series of other states in the US. They're trying to push it through in New Zealand at the moment. You may have seen one of the states in Australia where they pushed through an assisted suicide law. In the UK, it was about 3 years ago, I think now, and thankfully in our Parliament threw it out overwhelmingly, to quite a lot of people's surprise. But the debate is not going away. Okay? But one of the advantages, and I think it's a terrible development, I believe, these laws in the States, but one of the advantages for me as an economist is it does give you some data which you can then look at, to look at things like the Posner hypothesis. Okay? So this is what I've been doing with David Jones from the Anscombe Institute, and this is how we've approached the issue. What we've tried to look at is average suicide rates before and after. So taking a state like Washington and Oregon, looking at what happened to suicide, how did it change before and after, relative to changes in other states, because of course loads of things can affect suicide rates. Okay? But if you can have this comparison against other states, perhaps that are quite similar in lots of other ways, okay, and did that change relative to the states that didn't introduce a law, you can have quite a powerful test. Sometimes called a sort of quasi or quasi-experimental study. It's not like an experiment that medics would do in a randomised controlled trial, but for economists it's sort of as close as you can get. But you can also control for other factors, things that change. So over that time, maybe one of the states that we're looking at had a big influx of people perhaps from Hispanic origin who perhaps were more religious than others, and therefore we might have seen suicide rates go down for other reasons. So you control for lots of these other things. Maybe there's changes in income or factories shutting down, or a change in the gun law which might have made suicide more or less likely because guns are easier to get, so you might shoot yourself. Lots of things like that. Any of you who do study economics or data will, this is just to sound technical, what we used was a fixed effects panel data regression, but with controls. You may, the sort of medics may see this as sort of difference in difference analysis. Maybe that means nothing. It doesn't matter anyway. You can look at the statistics. For somebody like me, that's really fascinating. How well they're done and how close to a causal effect you can go. Okay, but probably given the data, it's as good as you can do. So anyway, what results did we find? We looked at two things, by the way. We looked at what happens to total suicides, because this was Posner's argument. In other words, whether you can call them normal suicide, it's probably the wrong word, but non-assisted suicides, suicides that were happening anyway, plus assisted suicides under the new law. Okay, that's the first thing. But then the second thing is, what happened to just unassisted suicides? Was it the case that they went down as we'd expect, that people moved from that group, instead of having unassisted suicide, they took advantage of assisted suicides, so suicides went down. Okay, so first bit of evidence, I won't give you lots, so you can look at the paper if you're gluttons for punishment. I'm happy to send it to you. Essentially, it's absolutely unambiguous. Total suicides go up when you have assisted suicide laws. Okay? The effect is reasonably large, between 6 and 12%. Actually, some of the more recent data we've been looking at, so we're updating the study, taking into account some of the newer states that have come in, suggests the percentage is even higher than that. So this result is strongly statistically significant. So you might have a result, but you can't be sure it's not due to chance. Yet it's statistically significant. It's very robust. So there's always lots of ways you can analyse the data. You can, maybe one state isn't representative. You can leave states out, look at different time periods, look at different statistical techniques. This effect is very, very robust. Much bigger for women and older people, as you'd expect. Assisted suicide, we can expect, focuses more on older people. Perhaps couldn't necessarily predict that more women would be affected. Okay? Now, this matters, of course, because suicide in itself is generally seen as being a really, something we want to avoid. There's World Health Organization guidelines on the tragedy. Most people see suicide as a tragedy. But if you believe assisted suicide is really for the benefit of the person, then you could perhaps argue, well, that's not really what matters. You know, those people getting assisted suicide were the ones who are really in pain or whatever it might be. So what happens to just other suicides? And this is what Posner said, well, other suicides would go down. And the evidence is, again, clear that they don't go down, but we have to be a little bit more cautious. So most of the evidence we find is that there's an increase even in non-physician-assisted suicides, but it's not so statistically robust. So some of the models find the estimate is an increase, but it's not statistically significant. Most of them suggest it is statistically significant, okay, but it's not quite as robust. So that, I said at the start, we have to be very realistic about the evidence and the data we get. But what we can be absolutely clear about is that Posner was wrong. There is no evidence at all that other suicides go down as a result of assisted suicide laws. So even though that's not fundamentally why we're against euthanasia, we know that argument can be very, very powerful to people who may be sympathetic, but say, well, if the law's not going to help, what's the point of not changing the law? If changing the law can actually reduce to suicides, well, no, the evidence suggests it doesn't. I'll put another caveat here, of course. We're talking about social science and people. So we always have to be careful not to be too definitive. You can get different types of studies. So we're looking in the States because it's a very interesting area to look at. You can make good comparisons. It's much harder to look in the Netherlands or Switzerland or Belgium or other areas where euthanasia has been legalised to some extent because you don't have that very nice comparison group, and often the data isn't quite as good. So, looking at just two studies as it will be, we have to be a bit cautious, but the evidence is quite strong, I think. Looking at the numbers, it's quite high. Assisted suicide in Oregon, Washington counts for about 15% of all suicides now. And it goes up very considerably over time. If we were to translate that into the UK, we would be talking about, depending on which end of the estimates you were looking at, between 300, 700, maybe even more extra suicides per year, looking at the total suicide statistics. That's quite a big number when you look at the number of UK suicides. Okay? So, as always, pro-life laws are right or they're wrong, but what's the effect and who's affected by these things? Of course, it is the vulnerable people. It's the people like Candice, who's in that picture I showed you, who's severely disabled and luckily had her mum to speak up for. Okay, it's people like that lady who was in the first slide, who had Alzheimer's and didn't have anyone to speak up for her, had her family actually hold her down, I'm sure thinking they were doing the right thing. Okay, it's the vulnerable people who are affected. So, I want to give you a chance for questions and discussion and so on. I don't know how we're doing for time. Looking at Anthony at the back. 5 minutes, okay, that's perfect. So I'm nearly done. So there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion. I just want to say a few things to finish off. Of course, we support or oppose laws because they're right or wrong. And as sort of a byproduct of that, it may be the case that some laws which seem to be pro-life, we might not feel they're worthy of our support. There's lots of debate in the pro-life movement about, laws that change the timing of abortion, for example. Are these something we should support? Sometimes those laws have exceptions for example, the handicapped or disabled people. And whether we should be supporting a law which has an exception for the most vulnerable of all is a matter of debate. But that should be what the debate is. We support a law because it's right or wrong. And I think good laws, the test should be whether they protect the most vulnerable. Whether they protect the most vulnerable. But when we're making our arguments and debates, there is strong evidence that pro-life laws do save lives. In fact, thinking about this, I'd rather rephrase it a different way, because actually the pro-life movement isn't, I don't think, about saving lives so much. Death happens. And at the end of life, sometimes it's the right time for death, and we're not looking necessarily to extend death unreasonably. Sometimes babies in the womb die, and that's very tragic. Really, what we're looking to do is to oppose the killing of innocent people. Okay? And I think it's true, we could rephrase that last sort of bullet point. There's strong evidence that pro-life laws do reduce the amount of deliberate killing of innocent unborn children and people at the other end of life. So you're going to go back to your schools, to universities, and to your workplace, talking to friends, and you know that you will sometimes have a hard time. Okay? One of the things we need to be always mindful of is that we keep the truth on our side. That we don't have to exaggerate evidence or statistics or look at or bend the truth. We work with the truth, and the truth is at the heart of what we do. We also know that many people are out there and will try to shut you up and to make sure the debate doesn't happen. And you always need to bear in mind what you are doing. You are standing up for the most vulnerable, the weakest of our society. And you're doing that because nobody else will. Nobody else will. So when they try and paint you as the extremist and the person who shouldn't even be debated and the society that shouldn't even exist in that university or the voice that shouldn't be heard, remember why they're trying to keep you quiet. They're trying to keep you quiet because they want to avoid a debate on the actual issues themselves. And I think what that means is that you, at work, at universities and schools, you are doing something very heroic. Because I think heroism is about standing up. Generally speaking, it's standing up for the weaker and the most vulnerable when it is difficult. And when you do that at personal cost to yourselves. And you always, in the pro-life movement, it's a constant theme, isn't it? We know we have to do things sensitively. We have to be aware of people who've been through some of these issues, who've had relatives who've died in pain, or if somebody who's been through an abortion. We know we have to be so sensitive and careful. But ultimately, what you are doing is heroic. And the pro-abortion and the pro-euthanasia lobby will try to shut you up constantly. Don't let them. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for that talk. That was amazing. I think it's brilliant. We can all agree that we have men and women that are looking for the pursuit of truth within their work field, and that's something that we can all really inspire to do ourselves. Right now we're going to have a 10-minute Q&A, if that's all right. So if you've got a question, just stick your hand up and make sure to speak up loud. So, any questions?
I think there's a mic coming around. Yes, it is.
Is there any good neutral sources that you recommend to provide facts and statistics on what you just talked about?
Do you want me to... We're doing one question at a time, or did you want a few and then... Okay, shall I respond to that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, yes. There's certainly some good... If you just want the raw statistics on things like abortion, on births and STIs and so on, yeah, usually the national statistics authorities give good, generally speaking, unbiased data on that. And one of the things I should have said, I've got some copies of the slides, and it's got my email address on there. So I'm more than happy if anybody wants to email me. If you've got I want to know what happened in Scotland at this time. I'm happy to point you in the right direction. So for the raw statistics, yes, there's plenty of data around. Looking at the studies and the evidence, of course, you have to be a little bit careful because there are better and worse studies. There's good and bad data. You can find an individual study that is quite different to other studies. And, some of the areas which I look at, the evidence is pretty much overwhelming. It's only in one direction, probably on that parental consent for abortion. On other areas, it's a bit mixed. You find things on both sides. I've looked quite a bit on sex education, and actually most of the evidence suggests sex education doesn't have much of an effect on anything. But you can find studies on both sides that will find different things. So, more than happy to act as a bit of a guide if you want to, you've got a particular issue you want to look at and want to look at some good studies on that. Okay. I think over here. Yeah, there's two questions over here.
Just on your, when you're relating the stats of the, suicide rate being affected by where PAS is accepted in a country, in Holland and Belgium, they can't say for certain the exact number of euthanasia cases because of some of them are undeclared. How does that fit in with the stats? Those ones that are undeclared. do you use them at all with your stats? You know, like.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and you know, you can't if the data isn't there, you can't use them. So what we look at the official suicide statistics. So every death, you know, the US mortality statistics, I think, are reasonably reliable across states. Their abortion statistics aren't at all. So some states are very good, some are very bad. Suicide statistics are okay. You know, like in the UK, you'll have each death will be classified. Of course, there may be some that you can't classify. You're not sure if it's suicide or not. Similarly, with the assisted suicide, one of the issues they have is they may give out a drug to somebody. They don't necessarily know if it's been taken or used. But in Oregon and Washington, which are the two states where they've had assisted suicide for the longest, they do have data, on the number of times they've prescribed the drug, and then the number of times when people are known to have died within a particular time of that drug. They can't always be 100% certain that that death is due to the drug, because you know the people don't necessarily have to say whether they've taken it, and maybe the terminal illness kicked in. But probably those cases are fairly few. So when you've got somebody who's been given the drug and has died fairly soon afterwards, it's a reasonable assumption to say they're in the figures. So we exclude cases where death didn't happen in a reasonable period of time after that point.
This sounds a super talk, really great.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, in relation to what the question the gentleman just asked, you know, the suicide data, the non-assisted suicide data, you say there's, I think, between a 1% and 4% increase depending on the study. Are the studies of a quality and of a number that they could be meta-analysed to give a more tighter no?
No, they're not. So we're the first people to look at the impact of assisted suicide laws, partly because there have not been enough states which have introduced them. There's plenty of studies looking at suicide, looking at the impact of, say, gun laws, of legalisation of cannabis. That's quite an interesting one, but no, not enough to do any meta-analysis. So.
I'd just be interested in knowing what the reaction in academia has been to your studies.
I think reasonable, certainly in the economics field. I mean, I think it's probably people are it's less politicised on this sort of issue, and people are prepared to sort of just look at what the evidence says, what the data says. My impression, Patricia might have a different view, I don't know, is that in the medical area, academics working in medical studies, things can be a little bit more political, and there's that whole debate about the abortion breast cancer link, and some of the people claiming that politics have got behind that. Certainly in my field, I've always felt I've had a fair hearing. You know, the way academia works, you write an article, you send it off to an academic journal, gets peer reviewed, and you know, quite often it gets rejected, and papers get rejected, and for all sorts of reasons. But I've always felt we've had a fair hearing, got reasonable referee reports, and supportive editors who are interested in knowing the truth. So the paper I had on, which referred to at the start by Grace about spending cuts, was finding that when we've had spending cuts on so-called sexual health services for young people, the areas that have cut the most, teenage pregnancy rates have gone down the most. So it's quite a controversial finding. But the referee reports were very fair, just looking at the stats, you know, asked us to do things as they would. The editor said, very interesting, you know, I encourage you to go and send it out, do a press release to get it sent out, because I think, you know, people should have this debate. So, you know, I can't say I've been felt discriminated against or had a problem in my area. That doesn't mean that doesn't happen in other areas. You know, I talked to other academics in sort of sociology, medicine, and they are, I think, a little bit more worried about the reaction they've had.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot from the statistics, and thank you. You made me reflect a little bit on the assisted suicide proposals. And I was just thinking, what kind of vulnerable people are they looking for when they make these laws, when they design these laws?
So, in this case, I'm sort of asking, what were the supposed normal suicides in this? So my impression is that assisted suicide is targeting people that were not going to suicide anyway. I had the impression, again, never looked at statistics, so I hope that you will have some data on this, that most suicides would be more for economic situations or some other kind of issues, rather than being told that you have a terminal illness. And I actually had the impression that people with terminal illnesses actually had good support in general. And there was normally like more of a calm walk towards death rather than sort of a rushed, stressful way of approaching it. So shouldn't they provide you or the politicians with stats saying our terminal ill people are suiciding illegally and badly? We need to help them out. See what I'm asking?
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah.
Shouldn't they provide actively this data? And have you seen any of this data? Is there any relation there?
No, it's a very good question. Actually, there are studies. It's quite hard to get to the bottom sometimes of why people commit suicide, of course. But there are studies which suggest that a significant proportion of people do have a terminal illness or cancer, and that is a factor in the suicide. So you tend not to have official statistics on that, but there's a number of studies looking qualitatively at this, and I can send you copies of those. And it tends to be more for the older groups. So when you look at suicides amongst young people, you're right, they tend to be very different. They're often sometimes copycats, sometimes spur of the moment, sometimes being bullied at school, all these factors that are going on. Of course, economics plays a factor for people. You lose your job and you lose your house and what have you. Family breakup is important as well. But there are a significant number which are based on, or appear to be based on the illness of the person. So these are certainly spoken about when people introduce assisted suicide laws. So they look at, we're focusing on people who are terminally ill, and this case comes up a lot. People, it's all right for everyone else, they've got the ability to commit suicide, but somebody who's terminally ill and in a degenerative disease may be in a position when they would like to commit suicide but can't, and that's why we have to provide assisted suicide for them. Now, you're right, it would be, perhaps the onus should be on the people changing the law to produce good statistics to say how often that happens, but actually, that's not, for me, the statistics on that aren't really the point. They certainly use that as an argument for assisted suicide. I think that's an argument against assisted suicide, actually. Those people, we should be looking for a different and a better solution rather than saying that, yes, in your situation, it's okay to be killed, whereas somebody else not in your vulnerable situation will say, oh, no, we'll support you. Actually, we should be giving love and support for everyone. But it's a very good question. If you want to send me an email, I'll send you a couple of studies looking at the proportion of suicides that are related to terminal illness.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the talk. That was great. I had a question. I thought it was interesting when you were chatting about the restrictive laws that have been brought in abortion in the States, the parental consent. I wondered is there a kind of, I know this is difficult to maybe quantify, but is there a kind of prerequisite of maybe the pro-life culture before, in these places, before these laws are introduced? And when they are introduced, is there a shift in maybe public opinion to be a significant shift in public opinion to be more pro-life? Because one of the things, just when you were saying, if in the UK right now a parental consent bill, for instance, was passed, would that embolden the opposition, and would the law last given the culture that we have just now? What should I think on that?
So, a very good question. Perhaps we need a political scientist to answer that. I think causation does go in both directions. So you're right, having a more pro-life culture means that you're more likely to get pro-life laws passed. But yes, pro-life laws do, I think, affect the culture. One of the things which I think is quite interesting about the parental consent laws is that that's a law that can actually reach across the divide. So I think there are many people who are not necessarily against abortion or are slightly ambivalent, but for whom the idea that a 13-year-old girl can have an abortion and their parents don't even get told is actually a thought, surely that cannot be right. And it's can be quite a helpful way of drawing people together. And not for cynical reasons, for the genuine reason that there's that they're right to feel uncomfortable about it. So I think it can help to shift opinion. I'm not aware of evidence on, opinion poll shifts in those states. Certainly, of course, as soon as you get pro-life activity, it does induce a counter-reaction, and it does embolden people, and people get very, more and more aggressive. And you see that, I think, not just in a pro-life law being changed, but any pro-life activity. So when a university sets up a pro-life society, that's when you start to get the activists saying, they probably weren't bothering before, and of course there's a counter-reaction. When you have, for example, 40 Days for Life, providing alternatives for women outside hospitals or abortion clinics, that induces a huge reaction and much opposition. I mean, it's hard to know what the net effect of that is. And in a sense, I'm not so worried about it. I think the fact that there's a reaction is probably a sign that you're doing the right thing, of course, you've always got to be reflective and say, am I doing it in the right way? Am I being sensitive? And am I, really doing things out of love? And that's important. As long as you are, the fact that there's a reaction is probably a sign that something's working and you're doing something right. Politically, I think you could say, well, if you took your argument not your argument, your question to one extreme, you could say, well, because of the reaction, perhaps we shouldn't be trying to do these things. And I think that would be a bit of a defeatist attitude to take. And I don't think there's evidence from the states that is the case. Actually, the more pro-life laws there are, it does get people thinking. So you have an informed consent law, or you have a 24-hour waiting period. I think that does help to get people thinking, okay, so actually abortion isn't just like a normal operation. It does involve killing something else. It is slightly different. And as soon as you get people thinking about what's really involved in abortion, then you're winning the battle. Because that's what we don't want people to forget what's happening in abortion. We want them to know what's going on. And I think these laws do help in that regard.
Okay, we're just going to have two questions over here together. If you could answer both
Okay.
in one. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My question would be whether you're aware of any abortion, euthanasia, suicide cases in Soviet Union and those post-communist countries where this question is still a big taboo and no one talks about it, and actually it's in a very stagnant period stage. So.
My question was about whether the control groups that you were looking at, whether one of them included the quality of the palliative care available in those particular regions, and whether that quality went down after the law was passed.
Okay, thank you. Two questions. That would be quite quick. The answer is no to both of them. There's very few studies I know on post-communist countries, and it's really ripe for analysis. I think part of the problem sometimes is that the data quality varies on abortion, but there are some of the countries data quality is quite good. It's about time there was more work done, particularly on the abortion issue. I'm not aware of any assisted suicide laws that have taken place in post-communist countries. You might be able to tell me differently. Certainly on the abortion side, Poland's a very interesting case, but there have been obviously lots of changes, I think, in practice, and again, you might be able to tell me more, in countries like Slovenia and indeed Russia itself, which I think would be quite interesting to look at. So no, but there probably should be. The controls, no. There's no, because we're looking at this sort of, big data, we're not looking at individual peoples or hospitals, we're looking at state level data. We have to rely on variables that you can observe across all the states. And there isn't really, we couldn't find a good measure of level of palliative care. It would certainly be interesting to do some case studies looking at, like Washington and Oregon. There probably is some work on that, looking at what's happened to the hospice movement there. I suppose in the statistical way we do things is because you can have controls for the year, you can look at trends over time, you can hopefully net out those sort of unobservable things. But if you had a really strong effect which was caused by the law that you hadn't anticipated, that only affected that state, yet that could mess up the stats. So thank you for the question. I think we're done then? Yeah.